camera. Give it off, down.
You know, when we first started Screened, we had a few different ideas for video features that we wanted to pursue. One of those was, of course, Half Good, which would revolve around films that were significantly flawed, but also had plenty of worthwhile aspects to them. One of the first films I thought about in relation to that feature was, in fact, today's movie, one that sums up the notion of a film being precisely half good in a way that it's hard to imagine any film toppling anytime soon. I am, of course, talking about Julie and Julia, a film that is half excellent biopic and half insufferable blogger whine fest. It doesn't help that it was directed by Nora Ephron, who's never found a sincere moment that she couldn't whimsy up with whimsical whimsiness. But she's bailed out in the end by a pair of remarkably good performances by Meryl Streep and Stanley Tucci.
I mean,
I know. I know.
I'm going to skip for a moment the usual half-good process of breaking everything down between good and bad, because for once, the film at hand cleanly breaks itself down, as it switches between the story of Julia Child and her travails in France in the 1950s, and Julie Powell, a blogger in post-9/11 New York who sets out to cook all 500-plus recipes in Child's book, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, in a single year. One of these stories is compelling and rich. One of them is horrid and vapid.
Hey.
Luckily, you only have to watch 5 minutes of the film to figure out which one is which.
well, I think I'm going to go to sleep now. Bon appetit.
If you had to describe the most boring movie in the world to me, you'd come close by describing a movie that tells the story of the inception of a blog. If you wanted to make matters worse, you could have the blogger in question spend a good chunk of time actually reading blog entries as she writes them, as if we were perpetually stuck watching the last minute of a Sex and the City episode. Or even worse, we could spend our time watching her write them while she reads them aloud, which violates about a dozen rules of actually making the film watchable. When Julie's not talking about her blog, or talking about her blog, or talking about her blog some more, she spends the rest of her time struggling with the most mundane and facile life challenges that any young person goes through. Oh, I don't know if I like my friends, or my husband doesn't understand me, or my mother's a bitch, or I don't want to prepare lobster, or I'm turning 30, or wah, wah, wah.
I'm a mess.
It's unfortunate that Ephron and her scriptwriters decided to infect the Julia portion of the film with a bit of the voiceover that weighs down the Julie half of things, as Julia will occasionally take the time to read a letter she's writing to a friend, describing her experiences in cooking school in Paris.
I am in heaven here. I've been looking for a career all my life.
Fortunately, though, the bulk of the Julia half of things is a simple and unobtrusive biography, anchored by Meryl Streep, who turns in a wonderful performance, even if that's a bit like saying Tom Brady is a good quarterback. It's pretty obvious what you're going to get when you cast Streep in a role like this, and she does a delightful job as Child, transforming herself into a living embodiment of Child's bizarre accent and mannerisms.
But you can always put it together. And you alone in the kitchen, who's to see?
It's a performance that is inherently smile-inducing. Although Streep earned the bulk of the award's attention for her performance, you can't say enough about Stanley Tucci either, who's similarly charming as her husband, Paul.
Joel? You're being a little over-competitive, don't you think?
The pair have the kind of unspoken chemistry that only really happens on film when two excellent actors are allowed to live their characters.
Julia, you are the butter to my bread and the breath to my life. I love you, darling girl.
There's a real kind of joy to watching the pair play off of each other, and even if their relationship is occasionally strained by the lack of children, the playfulness between the two is wonderful to watch and is a real reason to give this movie a look-see. What's more, Child's life is actually interesting, which is why it's a shame it's intercut with the travails of Julie. Child spent time in the OSS during the war and worked in Sri Lanka and China, but we don't see any of this, because this film is explicitly all about her cooking education, and because time had to be reserved for the latest boring meltdown by Julie, about her boring attempt to boringly ride on the coattails of someone who actually spent time innovating in a field rather than do something unique or original.
Is it bland?
Not anymore.
Efron may have been aware of the weakness of the Julia segments, which is why she spices it up by doing things like showing almost a minute and a half of a Dan Aykroyd sketch from SNL rather than concentrate on her boring life.
Now I've done it. I've cut the dickens out of my finger. Well,
That's bad, but what's worse might be that the movie doesn't even make the food it concentrates on seem that appealing. The best movies about food make you want to be in the same kitchen with the cooks at hand, but Efron never seems to want to make much of the dishes in the film, letting them pass by with little more than a delighted facial expression on Paul's face to commemorate the occasion. This is a movie about food, but it spends far more time concentrating on what's making Julie cry today rather than the pleasures of cooking. Julie and Julia is a waste of a perfectly good subject on a couple of different levels, which is a real shame. The Julia segments are often wonderfully entertaining despite the sometimes lethal levels of whimsical music that Efron and composer Alexandre Desplat slathers over her side of the story.
Bonjour. Bonjour. My friends.
Had the entire film been about her, it would have been easily recommendable. And again, there's plenty of material to work with regarding the life of her and Paul. Unfortunately, that story is paired up with Word Processor, the movie, which becomes more and more grating until we discover that even Julia Child doesn't give a shit about Julie Powell.
And I'm writing an article about Julia Child's 90th birthday, and I asked her about your blog, and frankly, she was kind of a pill about it.
That is a moment of such sweet schadenfreude that it almost makes watching her for an hour worthwhile.
Julia Child said that.
Almost, but not quite.
Has she read my blog?
And that'll do it for another episode of Half Good. We'll be back soon enough with another film, but I doubt it will be as purely half good as Julia and Julia is. It's still worth checking out to see Meryl Streep give a fantastic performance. Just keep that fast forward button handy for when she's not on screen.
Julia hates me. I used to be thin and now I'm getting fat.
I'm living with a totally self-absorbed person.